Hello all, and thank you so much for welcoming me back to Linaro Connect. I was here a couple of years ago with Harold Velte to talk about open source compliance. At that time, Harold and I essentially talked about two different sides of open source and compliance and governance. Harold talked about how the community and individual developers view compliance, and I talked about how companies view compliance. Now, in some ways, that made a lot of sense to show two perspectives. But in other ways, it also makes it seem like there's two communities, one community of individuals and one community of corporates. In reality, of course, here in open source, we're all so interdependent that we're really one community, and we shouldn't split things too far. Today is really going to be about an assessment of where open source compliance is and where we're going next. One of the key things to start with is probably that open source is not a solution. Open source is a fabric from which we can create solutions. And it has become so successful that it is in every area of computing today. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at an automotive conference where we talked about not only open source in cars, open source across the embedded cloud and enterprise system as well. And one thing that was evident at that time was that everyone is becoming clearly aware that open source as a fabric, as a platform, is going to be absolutely everywhere that we do software. And of course, we all know that software is absolutely everywhere that we do engineering. Now, given that open source is the fabric of computing, given that it is something that we need, it needs to be understood how we will use it. We need to have shared rules. We need to share the results. Open source, as I said, is not a solution in itself, but it's 80% of the solution that you need, no matter what sector you're in. Because everyone needs it, because everyone relies on the same foundation, we also need to rely on shared rules, shared understanding, so that we can get the results that we need. This has probably been one of the greatest challenges in open source governance. In the early days, well, how many of you were in this field 20 years ago? Oh God, are we dying off already? In the early days, say 20 years ago, the open source community was so small that basically we all knew each other. And the idea of having shared rules was very simple. Now, it's very different. At a conservative estimate, we have tens of thousands of contributors to Linux alone. We have an enormous community around the world of individuals and companies across multiple geographies, across multiple languages, and across completely different understandings of, let's say, legal approaches and the requirements for things like copying and sharing. This has made it somewhat challenging to have clearly shared rules. And that, in turn, makes it somewhat difficult to have shared trust and great collaboration. This has been something that we've been dealing with in the background for many years now. We are probably at the brink of some great solutions to make sure that everyone is happy. But we still have a little bit of work to do. The challenges today fundamentally are based on the fact that we're not looking at a small community with shared agreements. We're looking at a very large community where some people have different understandings or different behavior. And on the edges of this community, we have faced some quite severe challenges in the governance area. How many of you have heard of Patrick McCarty? Quite a few. Now, I know Heather was here, I believe, last year, and she mentioned Patrick McCarty's case. Patrick used to be a core developer in NetFilters, a contributor to the Linux kernel. He had quite a high profile. He receded from the active community of development and began to undertake a series of lawsuits based on his code in the German legal jurisdiction. Now, these lawsuits, for the first 2 or 3 years, exposed a slight difference of opinion between some individual developers and some corporate investors in open source. Patrick went after businesses that made mistakes in GPL licensing. And in the early days of his activity, people said, well, it sounds right. He's fixing something that's going wrong. He's forcing companies to behave. And companies said, there's something a bit off about this, because we have Patrick approach us, we have to sign an agreement, then he comes back with a huge laundry list of potential additional violations and requests a substantial amount of money. And for a few years, this was going on, where individual developers and aspects of the traditional development community felt that nothing was amiss, and corporates were increasingly saying behind closed doors, something is extremely amiss. Thankfully, communication started to happen, and we began to see, as we talked with many people, that the stories were aligned. Essentially, companies were being shaken down. And it had very little to do with community norms. It had very little to do with doing what's right. It had everything to do with a profit motive. Around last year, we began to see businesses talking more openly about what Patrick was doing, and we began to see the overall community engaging more actively in saying that some behavior is quite harmful. The NetFilter community released an enforcement statement, very clearly stating that they believe everyone must follow the licenses, but also clearly stating that activities such as legal enforcement, court cases, should be a matter of last resort, not first resort. The Linux community released a statement as well. That statement was originally drafted by Grant. He's in the corner there. And we saw additional activity in lawyers such as Heather, clearly explaining why copyright trawling was a huge issue. I talk about this quite a bit because Patrick McCarty's activities, litigating for what appears to be a pure profit motive, were harmful to our community. But more challenging is the fact that he has created a line of activity that could be inspirational to more dangerous actors. You're all very familiar, I'm sure, with patent trolling. Copyright trolling is the last thing we want to see in open source. I would say that activity like that is probably our largest single challenge today. And it's a challenge that we're working on addressing, but it's one that we haven't yet solved. The solutions that we're looking at in open source for governance tend to be about communication. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that nowadays our community is so interdependent that you can't split it out by one handful of stakeholders and another handful of stakeholders. You can't split it between individual developers and corporate investors. It's quite frankly impossible. Over 70% of the code committed to the Linux kernel originates in corporate projects. But an awful lot of that code is made by very high-profile individuals. As we acknowledge our interdependence, as we understand that we must always work together in areas like law as well as software, we're beginning to apply solutions that rely on a certain type of community spirit. With McCarty, we had clear statements from NetFilter and the Linux kernel saying that speculative copyright enforcement is not something that our communities support. In other areas, such as corporate code, We saw clear statements from companies like Red Hat and Google saying that when it comes to, let's say, GPL2 licenses, they will only enforce them in certain ways, similar to the GPL3 license. These solutions have all been about coming together, agreeing on shared norms, and making a certain pledge or promise to uphold them. This is terrifically important today. When we're looking at the cost of something like copyright trawling, we're talking about millions of dollars. When we look at the potential cost of breaking collaboration in the community, of not having shared understandings, of not working together, we're looking at billions of dollars of loss. Now, as we go through our solutions in this modern world, there's a tendency for the lawyers to think every solution is a contract, and there's a tendency for the engineers to think every solution is code. I'm a political scientist, so I think that every solution is an essay or manifesto. And it's actually interesting. I don't know if you've noticed it, but somewhere at some point, political scientists like myself permeated open source and were popping up in all kinds of positions. The last president of Free Software Foundation Europe was a political scientist as well. And I think the reason you find us appearing is because it's a social community. It depends on social norms and social collaboration. The solutions, like I said, are cooperative. And I'm going to give an example through OpenChain. OpenChain is a project that's been running for about 3 years, but it's only been public for about a year. And this project is about addressing one simple question. How do I trust my supply chain? And I think this is probably a question that in an area such as China, people can really resonate with. Talking with embedded companies, the average supply chain has between 9 and 27 hops, going from the initial silicon to a finished product. And because open source is everywhere, it tends to enter the supply chain at numerous points. And with so many different hops where open source can be introduced, it's actually very hard to keep track of everything, and mistakes happen. That's actually the weakness in industrial production that McHardy manipulated. No matter what you do as an endpoint company with your sticker on a finished product, no matter how good you are at compliance, one of your suppliers somewhere might make one mistake, and that might fold into your products, and that might hit market. And you can do everything that you possibly can to try and catch it. But because of the complexity of code, because of the speed of products, something somewhere will go wrong. In open source, we had essentially expected that when someone finds that something went wrong, they'll let you know, and you can go and fix it. McHardy was the first time that we had someone who didn't care if you could fix it. He wanted to get money out of you from that mistake, no matter what you did next. And this meant that we had a serious problem with the global supply chain. I used to help GPLviolations.org. I used to run the legal department of Free Software Foundation Europe. Now, we used to do a lot of test purchases on devices. GPL violations would test purchase, and FSFE would help in analyzing what we should do. Can you guess the percentage of test purchases with an open source compliance problem? Yeah, 100%. We never had a test purchase that didn't find a problem. And that's fascinating, because a lot of these test purchases were from companies which do try hard and really do have sincere contributions to the community. And we were looking at a supply chain problem. And that particular problem is more than an abstract. In terms of our community, we need to work on that because we need to have shared trust. It's very hard to trust each other if not everyone is following the same rules. In terms of our ability to use open source, we need to make sure that those hiccups in the supply chain are less, and when they do occur, we have a chance to fix them without big problems regarding finance or distribution of products. Now, OpenChain helps address this by, well, I suppose you could say, giving the big picture. OpenChain is not designed to be a prescriptive set of code, prescriptive set of processes, or a prescriptive set of policies. This is where we are a little bit left field compared to a lot of other open source projects. OpenChain is about looking at a legal entity and saying it's got inbound processes for software, it'll have internal processes and outbound processes. And what we do is we ask organizations to confirm they have certain processes in place. Do you have an inbound process? Do you have an open source policy? Do you have a development process? Do you have an outbound process? We don't actually care what the process is, we just care that it exists. Because if the various companies in the supply chain can confirm they have these processes, the likelihood is they will catch open source software entering the products, and they can describe it as it moves through the supply chain. That's why I said, how do I trust my open source supply chain? If they've got these processes in place, you can trust them more. And as a side effect, as they make a list of their processes internally, they can provide that information to their customers. This means that a company producing, let's say, a system on a chip can actually tell the purchaser who's putting it into a product, they can tell them how they monitored the code internally. This helps a lot in reducing problems, and it indicates a very promising future for us in open source. Given what I told you about our market situation, number one, we have a huge community. Everything that is software is related to open source. Number two, we have the emergence of things like copyright trolls who no longer follow the same community norms as before. Number three, we have a pretty consistent and excellent track record of having problems in our supply chain. And number four, we're thinking through how to solve them. Has led to an interesting mix of, I suppose, collaborations that we didn't have previously. It seems strange to say it, but the emerging and then clearly understood threat of Patrick McCarty brought together individuals and lawyers and companies in a way that we have rarely seen before in open source. Everything from Software Freedom Conservancy's guidelines for GPL enforcement through to the statements by Red Hat about how they would deal with copyright enforcement around their own code has put us more in tune than ever before. And this harmony, this collaboration has led to some fascinating and brilliant results. Patrick McCarty had a case just a week ago quashed in German court, not because they rejected the GPL, not because they threw out enforcement as a viable option, but because they said McCarty was overreaching. He was trying to use the combined work of the Linux kernel as something he could use for litigation. And the court said, no, your own individual copyright is what you can use in a case. And you have not provided sufficient evidence regarding your individual copyright to maintain the current case. And thus it was that an overreaching troll was squashed in one case. He'll be back. But we have a little bit of control about saying, no, you can't litigate with the whole kernel. Now, that particular case outcome didn't come from the company that was defending itself solely. There was support given, affidavits given from all types of individuals and community organizations to help bolster that case. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our future. As we deal with open source growing, we now understand that we have to deal with governance in a slightly different way. One person's problem, one organization's challenge, is a challenge for everyone using open source. We need to have clear understanding of our rules, and today we have much clearer understanding than ever before. Grant's work with the Linux kernel enforcement statement inspired NetFilter. NetFilter was first to market, so they win on speed. But it inspired NetFilter to make their statement. The Linux kernel made their statement. SFC released principles of GPL enforcement. We've seen a terrific amount of consolidation. And the future is not just statements and documents. The future is a lot of tooling to back this up. I don't know if you know it, but right now we've got somewhere in the region of 8 or 9 major projects helping with describing open source, scanning for open source, and continuous integration, continuous development. OpenChain is basically at the top. We're like the ISO 9000 saying, do you have this overarching structure? Just below us, there's a project called SPDX, which says, here's how you describe what's in a file. Here's a license identifier. Here's other identifiers. Then we've got scanning tools like FOSSology and ScanCode that can automatically scan through your code, read the identifiers, and tell you what's there. We've got CI/CD tools like QuarterMaster. We've got catalog tools like SW360. We have new tools which have metadata for projects, like the recently announced Clearly Defined from Microsoft. Combined, these open source tools and solutions allow us to have end-to-end governance that can be automated to a very high degree and gives us a very good baseline of where we need to be. The future of open source governance is probably we keep doing exactly what we're doing. We keep working together. We take this momentum that was partially inspired by a negative actor in our field, and we use it to make sure that our supply chain is as effective as possible, that where mistakes occur, we can identify them and fix them as quickly as possible, and that as a community, we acknowledge the value of shared rules and shared understanding. We understand that the complexity of software, the complexity of the supply chain may lead to mistakes. But we also clearly understand that we can and must fix those mistakes so that we all remain confident in open source. I'm very optimistic about this future because in just the last 5 years alone, I've seen compliance change completely from something that was individuals trying to get large corporate entities to comply into having a pretty flat arena where virtually everyone agrees on the same ideas and is working actively to support them. Now, when Heather spoke last year, I've seen her talk, and it was an excellent talk. And I think it highlighted the sense of urgency we had around compliance at that point. What I'd like to do with my talk is to underline that we took the urgency on board, and in every area of our community, we worked hard to address the challenge. And today, we're in a great position to have fair and reasonable compliance and to address trust between organizations and individuals. It's a very positive moment compared to the slightly worrying moment we had just 12 months ago. Now, as part of this, we're getting better at dealing with the fact that not everyone is from North America or the British Isles or Australia. And I'm from Ireland, I'm from the British Isles, and this is a colossal struggle for me, the idea that everyone doesn't speak English. But there you go. And that's where the next speaker comes in. So Lucien is going to come to stage, and he's going to tell you a little bit about license compliance in Asia, first in English, but then he has an excellent talk coming up in Chinese. And that's what's really cool. The open source compliance community doesn't depend on figures like me coming and talking in English anymore. It's more of a beautiful courtesy that Linaro extended to me. It has great thinkers and great minds available all over the world. And today, we have a Chinese speaker speaking Chinese and explaining how this works. Please welcome Lucien to stage.
Thanks, Cheng, for the introduction. I think I have 10 minutes to do the Asia update about license compliance. So, yeah. So, greeting everyone. My name is Lucien, and you are very welcome to call my Chinese name, Cheng-hsia, if you like. I have been doing the open source legal research for about 10 years. About maybe 12 years ago, I was the academic professional in Academia Sinica. Now I am the legal advisor of Open Culture Foundation Taiwan. So what I'm going to introduce to you is a few description about the update about open source license compliance situation in Asia. To be clear, mainly in the Grand China area. So, what I can share with you in the past 10 years, let's go back to 2005, the D-Link lawsuit. Back to 2005, I think not everyone in this room knows that D-Link lawsuit may be the first one substantially ruled open source about GPL infringement in the whole world. It is ruled in Berlin, Germany. And D-Link is a Taiwan-based ICT company. It sells a lot of embedded system equipment. Back to 2005 and 2006, as far as I know, people in Taiwan, engineers in Taiwan, in the ICT industry, they really don't know much things about open source license and the GPL. So most of the question they proposed to me in the 10 years ago was such a, I think, okay, so there's a point, no? No points. So, okay, there's no laser points. So let's just describe it. That's the whole question, most frequent question they proposed to me. Question number one, do we really have used the GPL license code? I don't think they should propose this question to me. They should propose this question to the RD department themselves. The question number two, what does reinstatement mean? If we are not allowed to be reinstated, should all the product be ceased to deliver by court order? Yes, might be in serious situation under GPL 2.0. And question number three, why we have to provide the source code being written on our own? I think they just don't understand that their staff are doing the development based on other people's open source code. And question number four, how can the product be obfuscated so that no one will know there's a GPL license material inside? Whenever they propose this question to me, I will let you know that my ability in engineer is limited in debugging and testing. So if they really want to do the obfuscating, they have to find someone else to do that for them. But every time I will tell them that this will cost you a bunch of times, and legally it will constitute somewhat willful infringement if it had been identified and tested. Question number five. Our own source code have been lost because of the engineers in charge have already left the employment. What can we do under these circumstances when we're receiving a warning letter for source code? This is a real case in real life. Actually, it did happen a few times in the past 10 years. So they don't have any repository or version control system for the code that they use in the product. So what have been changed in the past 10 years? After D-Link, there comes a series of lawsuits in the United States. This is a preliminary injunction issued by the federal court in the United States. It is BDBugs. In 2009, BDBugs, with the help of Software Freedom Conservancy, it brought the lawsuit against 14 famous ICT companies in the United States. As you can see, Samsung is in the list. And besides Samsung, the other companies actually are the partners of Taiwan OEM and ODMs. So this is a series of lawsuits that change the compliance scenes in Grand China area a lot. After that, the company in Taiwan and the company in mainland China came for my consulting. They don't ask the question number 1 to number 5 anymore. They are going proceed to the number 6 and 7. What exactly is the scope of source code we should provide? And how can we properly attribute all the contributor notice and disclaimer with so many free and open source components in one single product? So as you might agree, there is improvement in the attitude. Slow but positive in the open source compliance. In the past 2 years, a few companies based on mainland China even came to me for discussing about the strategy. They want to know how to put open source management into the competing strategy in the future. But for now, we have to admit one thing. There is indeed different thinking ways between free and open source communities and OEM and ODM, so-called manufacturers. For the promoters and the communities, they believe beautiful coding shall be art. Yet for the manufacturers, I think they only want time to market. And for communities, they believe intellectual property right can be owned respectively. But for the manufacturers, they just want to do, if they can, they just want to do the IPR management on its own. For communities, every contribution of code shall be attributed properly to an extent. And for the manufacturers, I think they appreciate no extra obligation imposed. And for the community, source code shall be provided openly among participants. But for many manufacturers, if they can, they think the source code provision should not in conflict with the company's benefits. And overall, for communities, share the knowledge is the one thing that they think they should do. But for the manufacturers, I think most of the manufacturers, the department in charge, they think they really want to keep the know-how confidentially, internally, if possible. So after, I think, just as like Shen mentioned, open source in today is like a fabric. No matter you like it or not, you believe or not, it's a kind of the foundation we do the development of computing. So finally, we have to make the peace. So how can we make the peace? Based on the experiments I spent in the open source research in the past 10 years, I think the main point is that we learn the rules from the license, we honor the rules from the license, and we have to find a way that make the companies, the manufacturers, and the community work together positively. So what I can share to you is that if you want to make your company compatible with the open source license obligation, the most crucial part is that you have to do the fundamental training for your engineers. You have to let the engineers learn copyright spirit in training courses for the better judgment, because for open source, they are different from a commercial solution. For commercial solution, your legal department will decide which one you should buy, which one you can use. But for the open source solution, they are you usually used by the engineers, by the research department itself. So you have to do these things in training. So I think the most part I can contribute to Linaro Connect this year is trying to share my experience about how to expand in plain word and in interactive mode with the developers that make them can understand the license obligations in simple way, clear but simple way, and a doable way. So in the 11 o'clock, I will hold a workshop about common understanding of copyleft in this very room. Because most of the scenario, most of the misunderstanding scenario are collected from the Greater China area. The workshop will be delivered in Chinese. But the slides of the workshop are made both in English and Chinese. So if you find anything interesting to you in the slides, please feel free to send me your suggestion or finding through the email. So thank you for your patience and attendance for the update.
Now, before you get rid of us off the stage, because technically we still have a tiny bit of time, I wanted to give you two insights. One is that a couple of years ago, when I was dealing with governance, people would often talk about mainland China as if companies didn't understand copyright. And that's always been incorrect. And some companies in China deserve to be given credit as leaders in open source governance. Huawei, for example, has had a great open source team for many years and has been very proactive in working with the international community. So one thing I'd like to stress is that even though we come from different cultures, we have a great amount of shared understanding of what we need for third parties to work together. The second thing is to give, I think, a rosy picture of the dark, deep underground of compliance, what really happens out there. In 2 years, between 2006 and 2008, when I was running FSFE's legal department and collaborating with GPL violations, we addressed and solved upwards of 150 cases. And less than 1% needed to be taken into any form of legal interaction. The vast majority of cases at that time, when we got a pure 100% score of incompliance, no matter where we looked, the vast majority of the cases were resolved by communication and by collaboration. And since that time, now 10 years later, we've got a lot better at this. And I think Lucien is one of the key examples of someone who has spent over a decade going around training people nonstop. And it's had a tremendous impact on bringing us all closer together. So this workshop at 11, I think, is a bit of a milestone for us. Lucien has been doing workshops in mainland China, I believe in Taiwan as well, helping an awful lot of people understand. But today's workshop kind of is a moment, a milestone, where a very large international community with a very large international conference gives a track in the local language on this topic and gives plenty of room for people to have great learning. I think Linaro deserves great credit here for making that happen. So on that note, thank you very much all. I appreciated your time. And if anyone's got an urgent question, we can take it now or later.